Hey, I'm Ben, Marketing Director with Kitty Hawk Kites and Kitty Hawk Surf Company, here with Will Freund from Kayak and Conversation. Will is doing a pretty interesting journey that we're going to talk about. So why don't you tell us about your project, how it got started, and what you're doing?
Absolutely. So yeah, hi everybody. Like he said, my name is Will Freund with Kayak and Conversation. And I've been working with Kitty Hawk Kites and Kitty Hawk Surf Company to take a Hobie Adventure Island, that's kind of crazy sailing trimaran, all the way from Miami, Florida, along the Atlantic Intercoastal Waterway, 1,100 miles up to Norfolk, Virginia. And that whole trip is kind of centered around the idea of trying to visit coastal communities and try and understand how different communities talk about climate change.
Gotcha. So you started in Miami. You're
Absolutely.
headed to Norfolk. How many miles is that?
I would say, as for the most part, anywhere between 1,000 and 1,100 miles, depending on who you talk to.
Significant journey.
It absolutely is. Takes me a little over 3 months to do.
Okay. So on the Hobie Adventure Island, so how much of it is sailing, how much of it is paddling, how does that boat work for the trip?
Absolutely, and that is actually one of the things that I love about this boat, the versatility with it, that you do have this great sailing power, but then, when the wind is not the perfect direction or the wind just straight up dies, you still have that Mirage pedal system. And so I'd say percentage-wise, I try and have the sail out as much as I can. Even if it's just that little bit of energy that I can get from sail, I always try and have the sail out. Or even if, the wind is dead, I can try and rig the sail to try and have it as be some kind of sunshade. Because being out on the water for 8 to 10 hours a day is a lot of sun. So even with how tan I am, I'm glad that I've had that sunshade to help me where I can. So I try and have the sail out, 90 to 100% of the time. And then probably paddling, I would say probably 60 to 70% of the time. Even if it's just a nice easy pedal, that little extra, knot or two of speed is a real help.
How many opportunities are you getting to dock and connect with people?
Yeah, so the general idea for a lot of my scheduling, I try and do, because it's big enough that it's hard to pull out of the water and kind of portage it like a normal kayak, so I actually tie it up in a marina. About every other day, which is hilarious going into marinas because you have your traditional sailboats and motorboats, and you come into a marina and people are like, not what I was expecting, but cool though.
Hopefully people aren't blasting with wake.
No, not. It depends. It depends. But the thing is, having that kind of boat spurs conversation, which is one of the things that's all about this project. Is people initially ask about the boat, which then leads to the project, which leads to me talking with people. So I try and tie up in a marina once every other day for kind of two main reasons. So one, getting fresh water, because I carry about 3 gallons of water on board at a time, which translates to about 5 Nalgene's of water plus a water bladder in a backpack.
How long does that get you?
It gets me about 3 to 4 days.
Okay.
I usually carry about a week's worth of food because it's mostly non-perishable, so it's nice to have extra food. But I try and be conservative with my water because being in the intercoastal waterway, since that is still brackish or salty water, you can't filter it like you would fresh water. So I have to be conservative with the water that I use. Totally. And then since I'm docking in marinas every other day, in between those, I actually anchor the boat out overnight. You can actually use a lot of the anchor trolleys that Hobie has, and you can actually throw out an anchor and then sleep on the boat overnight. Now, I'm going to then answer that part here. Yes, sleeping on the boat overnight. So I use a tent called a Camp Right tent cot, and that there is a whole community of people online trying to figure out how to best turn these into the ultimate adventure vehicle, because it's in its name, the Adventure Island. Why not make an adventure out of it? So I'm trying to figure out the best way to go long term on this. So I figured out a way to use a hardened board on either side of the trampolines to set up a tent and basically live on board. Now, it's not perfect. There are, limitations with it, but it's my best way of trying to be efficient so that I'm not pulling up on someone's private land, and trying to be safe as much as I can, using a GPS, using a VHF radio, to be efficient and be safe when I'm out on the water as well.
Gotcha. So how long did that modification take to construct?
First got the boat from you guys, from Kitty Hawk Surf Company, to then get this boat for this trip. I probably took me about 6 months to figure out the ideas, and there were a couple of different designs. I would kind of sketch up the designs, the limitations I had, then go back to the online forums and be like, hey, this is what I'm doing, what are your recommendations? And then it's just slowly build up over time that I would build something, go take it on the water, test it, see how that worked, come back to the drawing board. And it was an iterative process to the point that once I fully hit the water in Miami, I was ready to go.
what kind of lessons have you learned that kind of help you get better at it?
Yeah, the biggest thing is learning to understand how this boat works in the right kind of weather. Particularly for Hobie Adventure Island, when it comes to sailing, learning what wind conditions best work for that boat. That since these are multi-hull boats, having more than one hull, these are trimarans. They, as well as since they don't have a boom, they don't do what we call pointing or trying to go upwind. They don't do that super well. So trying to figure out, are there times when the wind is, coming not all the way behind me, because I don't have the spinnaker kit. They do make spinnakers for these boats, which are super cool, but I didn't have it for this trip. So trying to figure out the best wind conditions for this boat. And really, as I went along, of learning to read the wind and having that kind of indicate how my day went, of the route that I took and the kind of speeds that I would be expecting. Based on the wind conditions, as well as understanding the tidal conditions. That here, in the northern Outer Banks, a lot of our tides are more wind driven. But when you get further south to South Carolina and Georgia, particularly, tides are a huge thing that you can come in. That the distance between low tide and high tide could be upwards of 9 or 10 feet.
Oh, that's crazy! I didn't realize that.
Oh, it's absolutely crazy. Which the water level is not so much of important, but the current that produces. That there were some channels that I would go through. The one that comes to mind is one near Charleston called Wapu Cut. The current going there was over 5 miles an hour of current. So understanding where those currents and those environmental conditions are at helps you inform how you're going to best be efficient on that day.
Totally. It sounds like it could have been a workout.
It very much was. Thankfully, I was with the current that day.
Okay.
So, I almost didn't have to do anything, and I was cruising along. But I would not have been able to make it the opposite direction going up that canal.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit more about your project in particular.
Absolutely.
Why don't you tell me about some of the interesting people you met along the way, some of the really impactful stories you heard about how climate change is affecting people throughout the southeastern United States?
Absolutely. So I originally started out this project going in and trying to understand exactly what impacts were happening. And I learned fairly quickly that I actually had to shift the idea of the project a little bit away from the actual impacts to just the topic of climate change. Because a lot of the communities that I was visiting weren't even having that be a topic of conversation. So I would come into a community and just asking people hey, how has climate change affected your community? And we couldn't even get past the words of climate change, let alone the impacts. So
Gotcha.
I've kind of shifted some of my conversations to just coming into a place and just asking literally anybody, a scientist, an activist, a shrimper, someone who works in the restaurant industry, really everyone in that area, of what do you think about climate change? How do you feel? And really what I've learned from that is the conversation around climate change is anything but black and white. That you will get people, on, both extreme ends of that conversation, but majority of our country, majority of our communities are across the whole spectrum. That you get people that are very knowledgeable and then have very informed opinions about things. But the broad swath of our country is actually very undereducated on that, and I'm not using that as a I don't want to say
not pejorative.
I would say not against them, but just that's just a fact. And so what I'm hoping to do with this project is to highlight the need for more education. And I go into these conversations not with an agenda, but with open ears and an open heart.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to just make people start to think about it more, to talk about it more. So when I end up in these conversations, all I do is ask questions. I don't share my opinion. I don't tell people what they should believe or not believe. But I ask questions trying to understand where people are at. Because a lot of people right now feel very, on either side of whether they're fully, believing and on board with climate change or are skeptical of what's happening. People care about their communities. And so you have to start from that place of compassion and empathy before we can get to action. So I'm just trying to highlight that through storytelling.
I've got a couple more questions about the boat.
Absolutely.
So, do you think this journey would have been possible on a different type of fishing kayak?
In large part, no. On multiple levels. The first thing is this boat is one of the most stable fishing kayaks I have ever seen. Basically what I've generally learned is this boat's mast will snap before you capsize.
Okay.
that basically you can put this in absolutely crazy conditions. And I can speak that I've been in a whole swath of conditions that this boat is incredibly safe. That you can be out in big swells, you can be out in crazy wind, and that's actually one of the lovely things about this kind of sail, since it doesn't have a boom, is it's really easy to take into smaller amounts of sail in higher wind conditions to make it a lot safer, but still be able to make progress.
Okay.
And then also with the Mirage Drive, you can, particularly depending on which version you have, you've got the kick-up fins. I've got the turbo fins right now. That allows for even more versatility. And then even more so that, I'm not doing any fishing on this boat for a couple of reasons. One being that I didn't want to be, trying to clean fish as I went and with all of my other gear on board. But then on top of that, I had the realization if I was going to be fishing, I needed to get a fishing license in every single state that I needed to get to, and that was going to get very costly very quickly. Yeah. That I was totaling it up. It was almost $200 to get a fishing license in every state along the trip. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to catch $200 worth of fish.
Fair enough.
But I've seen people do amazing fishing on this kind of boat.
Right. Cool. Anything else you want to let our audience know about your trip or about the boat?
Oh man. I'd say the biggest thing with this boat is it is its own thing. That it sails not quite like a sailboat, but it absolutely sails. But it's not quite a kayak. But also back to its versatility, you can also break it down just to a basic kayak. You can take the side pontoons off. You can take the sail out. You can paddle it just like a normal kayak, which I think is really important. For me, I'm not using that because I've got it rigged up for my situation here. But I think that for a lot of people that's a major selling point that I try and talk to a lot of people on. But I think the biggest part that I think when it comes to the mission of this project is that I just want people to talk about climate change more and just have that be a topic of conversation. I'm not trying to change people's minds. I'm not trying to convince them one way or the other. I just want it to be something that people can talk about at the dinner table and have it be something that
conversation. It's right there in the name of your project.
It's conversation right in the name. I just want people to talk about it, and hopefully that will lead to something.
That's great. Well, thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's nice talking to you.
You as well.
And you can get your Hobie kayak from any Kitty Hawk Surf Company location. We've got locations here in the Outer Banks as well as down in Beaufort, North Carolina. So check us out at khsurf.com.